Welcome especially to many of our master's program affiliates who are coming to a visiting day. We're very excited to have you. I am Sarah Rim-Kaufman. I'm a professor in educational psychology, applied developmental science here at the Curry School, and I have the privilege of introducing our guest speaker, Laura Justice. So first I'll say this is a series. Today's talk is part of a series that's sponsored primarily by the Virginia Education and Science Training Program, or VEST, the pre-doctoral fellowship program, which is supported by the U.S. Department of Education and Institute of Education Sciences. So the VEST program applies rigorous research methods and analytic techniques in the social sciences field to study school and classroom effects. Many of you are enrolled in the VEST program, and I will say that our visitor today, Laura Justice, was involved in the development, the original development of the VEST program when it began. Just as a word of orientation, Dr. Justice will be talking for about 1 hour today and will leave about 15 to 30 minutes for discussion or questions. And please note that other additional questions she'll be able to follow up via email and any questions after 12:30. She has another appointment at 12:30, so we want to make sure that she's free to go to that. So let me introduce Laura Justice. So Laura Justice used to be one of our colleagues here at UVA. She's now the EHE Distinguished Professor at the College of Education and Human Ecology and at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. Dr. Justice is a clinical speech and language pathologist and applied researcher in early childhood language and literacy development, communications disorders, and educational interventions. Dr. Justice's research activities have been supported by many grants from the American Speech Language Hearing Foundation, International Reading Association, National Institutes of Health, and U.S. Department of Education, Institute of Education Sciences. I've always been impressed with Dr. Justice's prolific nature. She's published nearly 100 articles and books. When, as an assistant professor, when asked whether she asked her colleagues whether she should be writing books or articles, she got mixed messages, and she did both. Dr. Justice also is the founding editor of the EBP Briefs, published by Pearson, and is currently serving a 3-year term as editor of the American Journal of Speech Language Pathology. When I think of Dr. Justice's work, I think about how it is diverse and creative. I'm struck by the fact that she's done studies on library programs here in the U.S. She just recently enrolled a sample of 90 mothers of Mayan children in the Yucatan, and now Laura is engaged in some new work focused on classroom composition and peer effects. So today's talk will be Friends or Foes, Impact of Classmates on Preschoolers' Development. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Justice.
Thank you. Am I on? Is this mic? I was told to stay here. We'll see how that works. Thank you, Sarah. It's fun to be here because I started my career here. I spent 7 years here. When I came to Virginia, I swore I'd never live in Ohio again. And now I've been living there for 7 years. And I have no complaints, but boy, is Charlottesville pretty. So I'm actually engaged in a very risky thing right now because I was asked to give a talk. And when you're asked to give a talk, usually they just ask for your title first. And so I was like, oh, what can I do that's different? And I've been kind of playing with this thing called peer effects for a few years. And I thought, I'll just give a talk on peer effects. So I came with this cool title. And then they were like, we need your abstract. I was like, oh my gosh, now I really have to think about this. Then I had to write the talk. And what I'm going to tell you, I've been a researcher for 15 years. There is not one slide in here that wasn't developed for this talk here today. I've been laboring over this, and it's completely a new area for me. So it brings together economics, it brings together language development, it brings together social interactions, and 2 of those things I don't know that much about. So you can see which 2 you think it is. So this is a little bit risky, but it is really fun to think about. Everybody in this room has peers. You may have roommates, you may have partners, you have classmates, you have colleagues. And one of the things we want to think about, is particularly with respect to young kids, is how much do those peers affect development? Okay, so in fact, our peers, oh hi, I'm just our children's peers, are they friends or foes? And so hopefully by the end of the hour, you'll have some signal as to the answer of that. I do not work alone, and in fact, all these people probably did more work to pull all this cool stuff together than I did, and we've had some generous support that I need to acknowledge. So this talk foremost is about language development, or language acquisition. I feel comfortable talking about language acquisition. And language acquisition, I would argue vehemently that it's really the dominant aspect of early development. Now there's people here who study other things, and I just disagree with you. That what you study is more important than language acquisition, it's my opinion. But you know, when kids come into the world at birth, the first thing they do is cry. And over that first year of life, they develop much more control of the articulatory system. They begin to babble, and usually by the first birthday, they're producing a word or two and comprehending several more. And what you see here, what I'm going to argue is that, well, I'm not even arguing it, lots of people have argued it before me, that early childhood is very, very, very important when it comes to language development. And in fact, it might be what we can call a sensitive period. And so this is just a chart from neurons to neighborhoods where this is myelination and synaptogenesis in the brain. And what I just want to point out to you is this dark line is language acquisition. And what you see is at about 9 months is really the peak of synaptogenesis in the language areas of the brain. And by 6 years of age, it begins to tail off. What you see here is development of more higher order cortical functions. But early childhood is really the space where language acquisition is happening, and it's very important. Some people would argue that it's a sensitive period. For a long time, people talked about language acquisition in early childhood being a critical period, and people have moved away from that and said it's not critical that kids develop language skills in early childhood, but it is a sensitive period of development. And the difference is subtle. Critical implies if you don't have language skills by age 5, you'll never be able to talk. A sensitive period says this is a period of rapid neural development, and it's a very important time in which language acquisition takes place. And historically, if you study language acquisition, most of our evidence for this sensitive period comes from deprivation studies or bizarre occurrences like Jeannie, the wild child found, raised in a basement in California and nobody ever talked to her. So we have a lot of bizarre occurrences that suggest there's a sensitive period of development. But more recently, there was actually a experimental study that part of the goal of the study was to test, is there in fact a sensitive period? And this is work by Nelson and colleagues, and they worked in Romanian orphanages. And so they had 187 kids who were under 31 months of age, and they had all been abandoned as babies, and they were living in institutionalized care in Romania. And if you've ever been to an Eastern European orphanage, the primary characteristics of this are, number one, you tend to have highly rotating caregivers. So you might see 12 different adults interact with you over 24 hours, and typically children aren't spoken to very often. So it's considered a very impoverished environment. And so what they did is they had babies who were assigned to orphanages, and then they actually used random assignment to put some of the kids into foster care. And the primary difference to foster care is not that it was some middle-class stimulating household, but you actually had a reduction in the adult-to-child ratio, and so the kids, by virtue of being in this circumstance, got more input. And then they also did have a comparison group of never institutionalized kids who were raised in the same hospital. Hopefully some of you are wondering about the ethics of this. If you're not, and if you read the paper, they actually have done some papers about how they were able to do this, and what they said is the baseline is business as usual normal. And so by putting there weren't enough resources to take everybody out of orphanages, and so there were ethical arguments about why this was okay. If you look at the language skills of kids moved to foster care and those who stayed in institutionalized settings, By 4.5 years of age, you see a significant difference in the language and cognitive skills of kids who have moved into these foster care arrangements. And it's an effect size of about 1/2 standard deviation. But that's not actually where the test of the sensitive period comes in. I did want to point this out. These are the never institutionalized kids. So you see that there is a huge gap there that doesn't go away by 54 months. But this is a jump of about 1/2 standard deviation, suggesting that putting kids in potentially more nurturing, interactive environments provides a good boost to their language cognition. But this is where the test of the sensitive period comes in. There was variability in when kids in the institutions were moved into foster care. So there was a range of actually at birth up to 30 months. And so these researchers were able to look at, does the time you spent in institutionalized care seem to matter to those 54-month outcomes for all the kids who were moved into foster care? And what they found is that for every additional month that kids spent in institutionalized care, their outcomes at 54 months were 0.59 points lower. And so I just put this up as a comparison to kids who were put in foster care before 1.5, and you see they had 85 standard score points on this 54-month measure compared to kids at 30 months. So there are certainly threats to this claim. We don't know if kids who are adopted later have additional risks that aren't accounted for. But this is one of the better tests of the sensitive period that is out there that does suggest that having early stimulation and having input to the language system early in life is quite important developmentally. When we talk about language, everybody in this room might not be studying this and deeply interested in it. So what is language? There's actually, we use this word all the time. There's a lot of misconceptions about it. For instance, a lot of people think speech is the same as language, and they're not the same. When we talk about language and language acquisition, it's really the child's acquisition of the rules that govern what we might call words and rules or vocabulary and grammar. Language also includes phonology, which is the rules governing sound structure, and it also includes pragmatics, which is how we use language, which I think has a lot of overlap with the idea of social competence. Typically, when people are concerned about language acquisition in young kids, the focus is primarily on semantics and grammar as a very important part of the language system that's usually put in place and really mature by about age 6. So how is it developed? That's me and my kid. She was born here, actually, at North Jefferson Hospital. So people who study language, it's interesting, I work with a lot of people who study cognitive development, and what I've come to realize is that people who study cognitive development, they actually have different theories of how cognitive growth takes place than in the world of language acquisition. And I think it's because cognitive growth actually looks quite a bit different than language acquisition, particularly in the first 5 years of life. It's actually fairly effortless. Kids at age 1 produce 1 word, and a year later they're producing hundreds of words. So it happens very fast, it's very dynamic, and for a lot of kids it's relatively effortless. And so people who study this often focus on trying to understand really the mystery of how does this happen so quickly? How is it that kids by 5 years of age have an adult-like mature language system? And so a lot of people are interested in the relation between language growth in kids and the input to which they're exposed. And we call this learning by input theories of language acquisition. And there are dozens of studies that show that kids' rate of language growth in early childhood is correlated with aspects of language to which they're exposed in their environment. And so I put this up here. It's just a simple correlational graphic which shows, this is young kids, 3 years of age, and it's the relation between how many complex sentences their mothers use in their homes and kids' production of complex syntax as well. And so what you see is there's a correlation between how much kids are exposed to complex syntax and how much they're using in their own language. one of the problems with work like this, and there's an awful lot of it published, is it's probably not unidimensional. In other words, the language input is not causing the kid's language to grow, it's probably bidirectional. Parents are using more complex input, their kids produce more complex talk back, and so you get this interaction going on. But this is a very consistent finding. Actually, it's really hot in the popular press for people to talk about the million-word gap that separates kids who are reared in impoverished conditions and those who are not. People say, oh, there's a million-word gap between these two groups of kids. And the reason that gap exists is because of what's happening in their home environment. They're hearing fewer words. And that's a learning by input perspective. So we know a lot about the types of input to which young kids are exposed, and we also realize that that input seems influential to the rate of kids' language growth in both vocabulary and grammar. What's also really, really interesting and important to this discussion is that kids' language acquisition system is actually very, very robust. We talk a lot about young kids who are poor having poor vocabularies, but in reality, it's only a poor vocabulary relative to more advantaged kids. Kids who are reared in very poor circumstances, by first grade, they know countless words, and they have very sophisticated grammatical systems. You know, you can go sit down with a very poor 4-year-old, and they're going to say things that are too hard for you to diagram in a grammatical tree structure. And that's because the language acquisition system in kids is very, very robust. And part of that argument about robustness is what people call the poverty of the stimulus, that lots of the language that kids hear is actually pretty impoverished. Adults don't tend to talk in sentences. We talk in little bits and pieces and unfinished sentences, and so the stimulus kids hear is often quite impoverished, yet they develop this very mature adult-like grammar and vocabulary system by 5 years of age. Sarah mentioned, I'm doing a lot of work now in the Yucatan. This is actually a whole bunch of, this is in a village called Mayapan. I was just there in February. And these are Mayan mothers and their children, and they've all come out. We're doing some literacy work there, and they've all come out to hear about our program. And the reason, one of the reasons I'm really interested in Mayan families is because they're kind of famous in the world of anthropology and linguistics, because Mayan parents don't tend to talk directly to children. And if you go there, you'll see it. You know, you sit there and you watch these moms, and you know, some kids running by, and I'm like, isn't she going to tell them to slow down? No. Because that would involve directly speaking to a child. So what you actually have, and one of the reasons is, if anybody ever spends time in Mayan villages, is it's work is everything. Work, work, work. You got to wake up. You got to get the fire going. You got to put your hammocks up. You got to organize the yard, which is where you live your life. And so kids just run around and kind of raise each other. But this is really interesting. It goes back to that point, the poverty of the stimulus. Mayan kids talk. They talk a lot. They have language skills. And so how in the world are there kids out there in communities where adults never speak to them directly, and they have robust language systems? And so people are doing work in this, which is how in the world do Mayan children in particular develop language when adults don't speak to them? And that goes back to the poverty of the stimulus argument. And so in fact, young kids learn a lot of language simply by overhearing. And that's an important point to remember as we move forward, because I'm going to talk about what happens in preschool classrooms and the potential power of what other kids are doing in the classroom. And that when we think about kids' language system developing, it's not only developing because I'm sitting there talking to you. And there have actually been studies done where they take little kids and they look at their acquisition of words in a room where two adults are talking in the corner. And they show that kids can pick up those words by overhearing. So the language system is very, very robust, so remember that. Okay, so now we're going to move into the I take it you've seen these kids before? You saw them on YouTube, didn't you? Yeah. So if anybody is sitting here feeling a little bit left out right now, what you'll want to do tonight is go on YouTube and type in something like twins talking to each other. And so these are two little kids, and they're in their kitchen, and I'm always scared to show video in a talk because it never works, but they're sitting there conversing in some alien language. You know, they're having this conversation back and forth. One of the things, so peer effects is what I'm going to talk about now, so I've argued the language acquisition system is very robust. It's in a period of very active development in early childhood. And part of that development is dependent upon exposure to language from others. But that exposure does not necessarily have to be direct, like I'm talking to you and that's the only way you're going to learn my words and my vocabulary. In the world of language acquisition, people have seldom looked at the influence of playmates and the language that kids hear from others. We have a very rich tradition of looking at mothers, some fathers, but nobody who studies development is that interested in dads, generally. If you want to get famous, start studying dads. So mothers and some with teachers, particularly in preschools and daycares. But usually it's a mother-child phenomenon. And it's really interesting that a lot of people have not studied peer-to-peer. We do have work on birth order, and if you're studying birth order effects in language acquisition, there's a tacit assumption that there's other kids around and that might be affecting kids' growth by diverting parental input resources. But it's not looking at peer-to-peer interactions per se. What's interesting, and your brain is going to start to hurt soon. And you'll know it when it happens. But one of the things about studying peers in language acquisition is that when you study peers, you're transcending multiple levels of analysis. So this is interaction. You have two kids interacting. The unit of analysis is that dyad. So you have the interaction taking place, the unit of analysis is the dyad. Then we also, people who study peer competence and social relations, there's relationships, which are very, very commonly studied in the social literature. Things like peer aggression and friendships and popularity. And that actually has to look at qualitative dimensions of relations, like do you like me and do I like you back? But then we also have group dynamics. And so I work in a lab and I always think about the group and us coming together for writing meetings and how do we influence each other by being part of a group that's talking. This requires a different level of analysis of this. So this is why your brain's going to hurt, okay? And so when people study peer effects, it's important to understand and to think about what is the level of analysis. So we're talking about a kid, a pair, or a classroom, a dorm, a campus, a neighborhood. And really, the science that's going on needs to carefully consider these things. And it gets very confusing. I think there's a lot of errors in the peer effects literature because they're not dealing with the right level of analysis. So what are peer effects? Everybody here probably has an idea of what this is. This is a term that's used in the literature, and it says that basically peer effects are the impacts of your peers on you. And it's anything from the way you behave to the way you talk or your academic achievement, your accomplishments. So how many of you are in a sorority or fraternity? Okay, a couple of you. Studies of peer effects on college students have actually shown that participation in sororities or fraternities is highly driven by peer effects. And so those of you who raised your hand, I won't make you stand up and share your life story, but think about your life as a freshman and ask yourself, did my roommate join a sorority or fraternity also? And she's nodding her head. There's a pretty strong peer effect that if college roommate studies, if you have one peer, if you have one roommate who joins a sorority, there's a striking what's that called? A striking increase in the likelihood that your roommate will, in the future, join a sorority or fraternity also. So that's an example of a peer effect. The other thing to think about is when people study peer effects, I always think about people who are interacting closely, like two roommates or kids in a classroom. But it's not always at that level. Oftentimes people are thinking about schools and peer effects in schools, dormitories, neighborhoods. So people have to specify when we're thinking about peers, what is the space we're talking about? In the work I'm going to do, I think about peer effects as a group level phenomenon. So if I'm in a college dormitory, my peer effect is what happens in my room, not my dorm or my campus. Okay, but lots of people do it different ways. If you begin to look at the peer effect literature, the vast, vast, vast majority of empirical work is done by economists. The vast majority. This is an example of a paper that I really liked that came out in the Journal of Applied Econometrics a couple years ago, 2003. And this is really a classic type of thing you'll see in the economics literature. One of the reasons economists are interested in peer effects is because if we can learn more about these, they're a really important input to lots of systems that we could then manipulate to promote efficiency or better outcomes. So lots of economists are interested in this. And in general, I say consistently observe effects, but I was seeing some things yesterday where there were some inconsistencies as to the extent of peer effects. I'll talk more about this in a minute. But in general, people who study this believe it's a real phenomenon. Okay? Yeah, we'll leave it there. Okay. Most of the studies on peer effects are correlational, but there are some experimental studies or quasi-experimental studies that provide more satisfaction to the idea that peers might causally affect one another. So an example of this is the Dartmouth roommate study done by Sacerdote back in 2001. In Dartmouth, like a few other institutions, randomly assigns freshmen to roommates. Anybody have a random assignment? Good, so some people, I don't know if does UVA do it? Random assignment? Yeah, do they do random assignment? Some places do quasi-random assignment, but Dartmouth and some others do total random assignment. And so what you do, I think this was back in about 10 years ago. As you know, it is important that Dartmouth at this time was the 6th most selective undergraduate. And a lot of the studies that people refer to on peer effects, they involve college students, random assignment, and they're almost always selective institutions. So the question is, do these really generalize to non-selective places like UVA? Okay, so they did random assignment to dorms and roommates, and they actually, I was reading the random assignment, they actually shuffle things by hand, which suggests this didn't happen last year, but maybe last decade. And then what they do is they create blocks of variables. So gender, you know, they would have girls versus boys in random assignment within that block. Smoking, only 1% of students smoked, which was interesting. Do you listen to music while studying? Do you keep late hours, and do you consider yourself clean? And so those are actually the... No. See who shows up as your roommate. But these are actually the 5 blocking variables in the Dartmouth study. And most other random assignment use something like this. It's interesting to start looking at what are the questionnaires and then how do they create the blocks by which to create roommates. And there was some variability in freshman GPA. On average, the students at Dartmouth had a 3.2 at the end of the year, but there was some variability. This guy didn't do so good. And then you have your straight A performance. And so the idea around this study is, does your college roommate, based on random assignment, affect your GPA at the end of the year? This is just a correlational study, which is the relation. It actually doesn't look a whole lot different than the correlation table I showed you earlier of parental language complexity and kids' language complexity. This is freshman year GPA and their own. This is the roommate's GPA correlated with one's own academic background. And what you see is a correlation between these 2 variables, and in this paper they found a 1 standard deviation increase in roommate GPA is associated with a 0.05 increase in own GPA, or every one of those increases. So it's not a huge effect, but it's a consistent effect. The other thing they did in one of the analyses, when they ignored dormitory, and then they said, well, we really need to control for dormitory, because what if something crazy happens in one dorm? So even when they control for what dormitory you're in, that effect still holds. The good thing is it goes away in 4 years. What's interesting is this is just GPA. If you start looking at this research, there's stronger effects for things like time use, sorority involvement, alcohol use, and those effects, I don't know. You know, sometimes these are lifelong decisions, but GPA is more fluid than that. So the peer effect goes away in 4 years. But the reality is it is there early on, and it's a fairly consistent finding in these studies. Okay, so what about young kids? Get my clock. What about peer effects in young kids? So if we know that college roommates can affect one another in things like achievement, could we assume that the kids that young children are talking to across their day might affect their development in ways that are somewhat like achievement? And I would argue yes. And some of the reasons behind that are, we already know that in early childhood there's a very robust, very active period of language acquisition. When you study peer effects, it's really important you have a good outcome that makes sense to study in relation to peers. And language acquisition is the perfect one because of the language by input hypothesis. If our language system grows as a result of what we're hearing from others, it would make sense that what we hear from our peers ought to be influential. The influence of parents and teachers on kids' language learning is very well established. And I would argue, because I've been studying what happens in pre-K classrooms for a while now, I would argue that kids are hearing a lot more talk from their peers than their teachers. A lot more. And so when you start looking at how kids in preschool classrooms spend their time, they spend a lot of time in free choice activities. And I can tell you that during those free choice activities, they're not interacting with their teacher. They're interacting with one another. And they spend a lot of time in meal and routines. And so this is teacher assigned activities about a third of the day, but I would argue that for about 2/3 of their day, meals, routines, and free choice, they are interacting with one another. And what we also know is that when we start to look at classrooms, there are individual differences in the language skills of kids within these classrooms. And so what do I mean by that? I just pulled data from one study that we have, and I randomly pulled out 2 classrooms. And what you have, I had data from one classroom for 13 children and 10 children in the other. Okay, so these are preschool classrooms, and these are classrooms that have what are called targeted enrollment practices. So a targeted enrollment practice is you can come into this classroom if you meet certain enrollment criteria. Usually it's you're poor or you have other risk factors in your life, like you're homeless or you've been a victim of abuse, that sort of thing. So that when I use the word targeted enrollment, just keep that in mind. They're usually targeting enrollment to kids who exhibit risk. So I pulled 2 classrooms, all the data I had on the kids in that classroom, and this is actually their standard score on a standardized measure of language called the SELF. And what you have here, what you see is the means are actually very similar. So across these classrooms, on average, the kids get a standard score of about 92, give or take, which is about a half a standard deviation below the normative mean. But then you have this range, okay? So in this classroom, these kids are ranging from 77 to 117, and here from 7 to 105. You could say, well, is that going to matter? Is that going to matter if you have a 4-year-old child and they're dropped in this classroom versus this classroom? Could this difference matter to their language acquisition over the next 9 months? And this is an important question, really, to ask. Another way of conceptualizing it is by looking at the range. I showed you the range of scores. But if you do something like this, it's actually a lot more telling. So these are the same classrooms. I'm pretty sure. Oh, no, this is a different classroom. So this is a different classroom. You have a mean of 94, standard deviation of 16, and we only had 7 kids in this classroom. Excuse me. But what I want you to see is if you're a child who's in classroom 1, and so this is a histogram, it means we have 1 child in this classroom who got a standard score of 75 on that standardized language assessment in the fall. That's not a good score. Okay, that's not a good score. It's almost 2 standard deviations below the mean. So not good. So you're this child and you land in this classroom versus a child who's similarly skilled and they land in this classroom. And what you see is the peer structure differs, okay? So this child who has a score of 75 has 4, I hope, that better be a 4. We don't have 3.5 kids. They have 4 kids who are similarly skilled with whom to play. Whereas this, if we look at these kids who are getting 80, you see more distribution. These things are subtle. They are subtle, but could they matter developmentally? And so this is, when we think about peer effects, generally the way this is modeled is we take the average score of the kids in one classroom and try to predict the language growth from that variable. And you would see this, the average would be different, but then you have to start to look at the range of experience. One of the reasons studying this gets really complicated is if we take the average score and the standard error for the kids that sit in this classroom and try to predict language growth compared to kids in this classroom, one of the things that's really complicated about that is we don't know who kids are interacting with, okay? This is who kids are interacting with. And so this is a different study. Again, I just pulled data. And these are 3 different classrooms in this study, and this is an approach called social network analysis, or SNA. And with social network analysis, you can actually look at who do kids interact with. People almost never do this with preschool kids. And one of the reasons is most people who do social network analysis use who people say they interact with. And if you ask kids who they interact with everybody. So they're very bad informants. But these are data, but I asked my son, who do you play with? Everybody, Mom. But these are actually I'll share a little bit more with this later on, but these are teacher reports of kids who interact with in their classroom. And so what you actually see here, these are 3 different classrooms. The social network is distinct in all of these. So this is a classroom that I would actually describe as very egalitarian. So we only have data in this class. We have about 5 kids per classroom. And the strength of why you have a thicker line is the kids are interacting more with each other. A thicker line means a denser connection between kids. And here you actually have a very egalitarian structure where everybody's interacting with each other deeply. This is more of a hierarchical structure where you have this kid in the middle. I always want to say that's a popular kid, and then I get in trouble. Like, that's a popular kid, and they're like, no, that's a kid that has a lot of social ties. We don't know if they're popular, but they have a lot of interactions with everyone in the classroom, okay? So I always try to call these 2 kids, these are friends, and my social friends are like, the social researchers are like, no, we don't know if they're friends. We just know they interact with each other. So these may not be friends. Do you see the difference? These 2 kids, this child oftenly seeks to interact with this one, or seeks to interact with this one. That's the arrow. This child does not. Yeah. Now these 2 kids actually tend to interact with each other. However, they may not be friends. I have learned that by being corrected many, many times. They could be hitting each other. We don't actually know. Now this is an interesting classroom because you have this isolate over here. So this is a child who is not part of the network, and we don't know why. So this is why your brain starts to hurt if you want to study peer effects, because you can think about the classroom like this, and this is really where the research is right now. We use this as kids' social network, and we don't think about this. But now my work, I hope to take it in this direction, and I think that's where the peer effects literature will go, is using social network analysis to really just understand peer effects. And I'll share a little bit with what we're doing later on with that. But really, if we study kids' interaction and the influence of partners on language skill, we probably need to be here. But that's why this is complicated to think about. The other reason that we need to get really serious about understanding peer effects in preschools is that we track. This is a aspect of schooling where tracking happens, and it happens often. And one of the reasons it happens is because of the way we fund preschool. So we have kids whose parents pay for them to go to preschool. So they're usually going into classrooms where all the kids' parents have enough money to pay $1,000 a month. For the rest of the kids, They are probably, now this is, some states do have universal pre-K, but not that many. So typically what happens in a state like Ohio or a state like Virginia, you have schools or classrooms that are created, and you can only get in that classroom if you have a risk condition. And most often it's because your family's poor, okay? And so what we're doing in many preschool classrooms across our country is clustering poor children within one classroom. The other way we fund preschool that's legislated by federal law is that we put kids with disabilities in classrooms. And people argue with me about whether this happens today, that we have self-contained preschool classrooms full of kids with disabilities, but we do, and they're all over the place. And so one of the issues is that if you're interested in special education, kids who have disabilities between 3 and 5, they're required to be educated in the least restrictive environment. If that kid was in first grade, the least restrictive environment would be some classroom, hopefully, that already exists. In a lot of states, if they don't have a lot of pre-K, they're going to create classrooms and put kids with disabilities in them. In Ohio, I'll talk more about this, in Ohio, our preschool programs are supposed to be inclusive, which is 6 kids with disabilities and 6 kids without. In our state, we do not have universal pre-K, so we don't have slots for lots of kids who need slots. So what they do is they put very, very needy kids as those typical peers. In Columbus, Ohio, it's often Somali kids. We have the 2nd largest Somali population in the US, and we have lots of kids who are from Somali families, and they want to put them in preschool classrooms, but we don't have them. So oftentimes our classrooms are 6 kids with disabilities and 6 Somali kids. Is that good for kids? Is it good for kids? Is it good for your kid if you have a child with autism spectrum disorder and that's the placement pattern? And I think we need to ask these kind of questions. If we ask these kind of questions, it's a peer effect question. Okay? Oh, I was just going to point this out. In a lot of the work I do, I'm in these classrooms, okay, Head Start and public pre-K classrooms, which are targeting enrollment. And if you look at the language skills of kids in these classrooms, they are different than the normative values we see in the population. So in this study, we had 518 kids. I just opened SPSS, took the whole data set, and said, what is the fall score on the standardized measure of language for all the kids in this study? And it was 87, okay? The normative mean on this measure is 100. And what you can see is what these are all targeted enrollment preschool classrooms, the mean across that sample was 87, which means if you're a parent and you're poor and you put your child in a pre-K classroom, they're surrounded by classmates whose language scores are lower than a normative mean. And so this is just a histogram of those data, those 500 or something kids. And what you see is it is a normal distribution. It is a normal distribution, but it jumps about 10 points down. And so you have to ask yourself, are these type of placement patterns good for kids, particularly in the area of language acquisition? Okay, so if peer effects do operate in preschool classrooms, and we don't know yet, because we haven't gotten those slides, but if peer effects operate in preschool classrooms, I would say that these placement patterns, they could actually have good effects or adverse effects on kids' development. And so when we think about peer effects in preschool classrooms, we're looking at kids' language growth in relation to the skills of the kids they're spending their day with. Okay, so just to transition forward, so the peer effects research to date is mostly done by economists. Economists. Am I an economist? No. Is anybody here an economist? Oh, shoot, I'm going to get busted soon. So it's mostly conducted by economists, which means I've been reading a lot of economists' prepared papers. And the questions are similar oftentimes, but the methods are somewhat slightly different. So I'm like, is a fixed effect in that paper the same as how I would do it here? So it's been fun. Most of the studies done on peer effects are not interested in child development per se. As I mentioned earlier, studies of high school kids and college students tend to dominate. And a lot of it seems to be embedded in research on the economy of higher education, right? Oftentimes, these studies use correlational designs or regression designs without experimental design, which raises a huge risk. And that's another reason why peer effects research is hard and messy, because we don't randomly select who we interact with. So if you think about those classrooms I put up there earlier, you've got 16 kids in a classroom, it's probably not random how those kids got into that classroom. Maybe the kids are friends, and so they asked to be in the same classroom, they live in the same neighborhood, maybe they're cousins, we don't really know. So there's a lot of selection bias. And the only thing I'm going to say about that is this literature on peer effects, it's very aware, it's as if literature is a person. The people who are producing the literature, they're very aware of the problem of selection bias, and lots of people do lots of things to try to address it, like add in 1 million covariates. But at the end of the day, you'll have to just determine for yourself, am I comfortable believing the peer effects literature? And one of the reasons I feel comfortable with it is because of the few well-conducted experimental studies. Rarely, I've only seen one prior paper done by an economist team, Henry and Hickman, who looked at preschool kids, done in the early 2000s. So it's really an untapped area of study. The other thing I want to point out is, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, when people talk about peer effects, rarely is there attention to the mechanism. Now, I've suggested through the last 40 minutes that I believe there's a mechanism which has to do with input, that kids are talking to and hearing one another, which is affecting their language system. But an indirect mechanism would be that when you have a class of highly skilled children, they evoke better instruction from teachers, which then contributes to advanced language skills within a classroom. It's actually still a peer effect, but it's mediated by instruction. And so I'm actually going to get to this a little bit. That's why I'm bringing it up now. Okay, I'm going to talk quickly about 5 papers we've done on peer effects. 2 published, 1 in revision, and 2 that are going out very, very soon. And before I move forward, I want to point out 3 things. I'm just going to point them out now and then not revisit these again. Number 1, all of these we're looking at growth in language skills. And we do that by, we always have a measure in the fall and a measure in the spring of an academic year. And we use what's called a residualized gain approach, where we predict spring skills controlling for fall. Okay, we can bicker over if that's the right way to measure gain or growth, and people bicker about that. And I'm just saying this is the way we elect to do it, a residualized gain approach. I'm always nesting kids in classrooms, okay? So we're always viewing kids within a classroom and the peers within a classroom as their peers, okay? And oftentimes I'm presenting to you the most parsimonious model that we ended up with at the end. And so I'm kind of skipping, we covariate for this, 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 and this. And I'm more than happy to give you all 5 of these papers to study and question me about. Okay, the first paper came out a couple years ago, and it was just very simply, do peer effects operate in pre-K classrooms? Do they exist? And so this was the initial examination of our kids' language skills or language growth, again using that residualized gain model. Are they affected by the skills of the kids they're going to school with? And so in this study we used a very large array of classrooms. This was a secondary data analysis, and so we had access to data on 453 classrooms in 11 states, which represented about 80% of pre-K enrollment. So this is a very general test. Do peer effects exist in pre-K settings? And so we were looking at main effects of peers, but we did investigate a few moderators of those effects. In other words, are these peer effects conditional on where kids start in the fall of the year and the quality of their classroom? So I'll just go through this quickly. It was a study of 1,800 kids, 2 existing databases, the sweep study and the multi-state study. What's interesting is we only had data on 4 kids in every classroom, a randomly selected 25% of kids in the classroom. I was stunned this paper was accepted and published in Child Development, and nobody ever questioned that, actually. And so I was stunned. But we had data on a randomly selected 4 kids per each classroom to represent that peer effect. I'm just glossing over measures. I'm assuming most people aren't that interested in this, the measures we use, but if you are, please just let me know later. So we had a measure in that study of vocabulary and language comprehension collected in the phonus room. And because this was a very large sample, the kids were relatively typical in their language skills. Their mean score was 95 as standard score in the fall. So they're closer than the classrooms I shared with you earlier. We also have the class, I'm assuming you've heard of this, classroom assessment scoring system, which comes from UVA, work done by folks here, and it gives you a general measure of the instructional quality of the classroom. And in this study and in all others, we're almost always using multi-level modeling, typically 2 levels where you have kids nested in the classroom, okay? I'm not even gonna go into this. If anybody's really interested in multi-level modeling, anybody really interested in multi-level modeling? There's a big problem when you do peer effects, which is, do you represent the peer effect as a child level variable or a group level variable? And we've struggled with this, but nobody's sitting there chomping at the bit for that detail, so I'll just move on. Okay, what I want to show you is this. So we have these 2 outcome measures, receptive language, expressive language. And these are our covariates in this. And I'm just going to point out this. This is the average language skill of kids. This is the average level language skill of your classmates. And what you see is a positive effect on kids' receptive language and expressive language. So in the context of these covariates, what we can see here is that a child's language growth over an academic year is associated with the average level of language skills of their classmates. That's the peer effect, and it's positive. I am going to point this out, and I'm just going to point it out because it's interesting. We looked at whether kids' language skills in the fall of the year moderated that peer effect. And the reason we would look at this is that there's a trend in the literature for kids who have low abilities or low skills to be influenced most by their peers. Okay, so you have a child who has low skills or low academic achievement. They seem to be more affected by peers than highly skilled kids. So think about those first-year students at Dartmouth, if it actually didn't play out in that study. But you have a child or an adult who has a 2.0 GPA and a 3.0 GPA. The student with the low GPA is more influenced by having a high-achieving peer than the student. So the argument is that kids who are low achieving or have limited skills can really be bolstered by having access to skilled peers. We did not find that in this study. So what you have here is an interaction between kids' fall language scores and their predicted spring language as a function of their peers. Okay, I'm just going to point out this side of the chart. And so what you have here is that kids who have high abilities in the fall of the year on a measure of language seem to get a bigger boost from having highly skilled classmates than kids with lower skills. Does that make sense? The reason I point it out is it's actually the opposite of what we see in the literature, which is the real benefit is for kids with low skills to be enhanced by having high achieving skills. But I would ask this, is it due to sample characteristics? And this is an issue that comes up in a lot of the college studies. If we're only looking at selective settings, is that a peer effect that can generalize? And so to summarize this, though, what we can say is we do see peer effects operating in pre-K settings. The effects are relatively modest in size, but we see this, that kids with more advanced language skills seem to benefit more from having more advanced classmates. But does this hold if we go into these targeted enrollment classrooms, where the kids as a group have relatively low levels of skill in language? Okay, so that was the next study we did, where we looked at targeted enrollment classrooms where kids they go into these classrooms, they have very low levels of skills, at least normatively. And so in this study, the mean score in the fall of the year on a measure of vocabulary is 90, which is almost, it's 2/3 of a standard deviation below the mean. So as a group, 40% of these kids had what I would call subclinical language issues. And so again, we looked at kids' language growth in targeted enrollment classrooms as a function of the group. Okay? I'm going to ignore the statistical issues here. It's really just, how do you represent a peer effect? Is it a child level phenomenon or a group level phenomenon? Okay, your brain's about to hurt, bear with me. It's almost lunchtime. Just by way of background, this is a study of 338 kids in 49 classrooms, and again, these are all targeted enrollment practices. So these are classrooms designed to serve kids who are poor or at risk. We have measures in the fall and the spring. There's always slight variations in how we do things based on the data we're looking at. So here we use a latent variable approach. Again, we have the class, and we're using multi-level modeling. Okay, here's the brain hurt part. Okay. I'm just showing you a result that I want you to try to make sense of. And what it is there is a peer effect in these targeted enrollment classrooms, but the peer effect is moderated by where kids start in the fall of the year, and it's the opposite pattern of the other classrooms. Let me just point, it's shown here, so bear with me. What you have here, the low initial status, these are kids who have very poor language skills in the fall of the year. They come in these classes, they are in these target enrollment classrooms, they have the lowest achievement in language in the fall of the year. And this is a comparison of those kids, their spring predicted language scores for low classmates and high classmates, okay? So what you see here, and it's a difference of more than a half a standard deviation. It's actually a pretty big effect. What you see is when you have kids in target enrollment classrooms who have low language skills, there is a difference in their language growth over the year dependent on how skilled their classmates are. And if you have kids who have low language skills in the fall of the year, -1 standard deviation, they actually seem to lose ground over the year when their classmates don't have very good skills. Does that make sense? And they actually, compared to skilled kids, they actually showed a 1.5 standard deviation decrease in language skills over the year. That's what our model suggested. The other thing to point out is that peer effect had very little bearing on highly skilled kids. That's this. So these are kids in the fall of the year who had high language skills relative to the group. And if they had highly skilled classmates or less skilled classmates, it didn't matter. And that is a very consistent finding in the peer effects literature, that when you have highly skilled kids, they're pretty impervious to the peers. But when you have limited skills, not so much. They seem to be pulled down by having classmates who are also have limited skills. And I am glossing over a lot of details, trying to highlight the major findings. So we have 2 studies showing peer effects are operating in preschool classrooms, a very similar pattern. But in the second study, we go into targeted enrollment classrooms where 40% of the kids have language skills more than a standard deviation below the mean. And what we see is when those kids are in classrooms and their classmates are also similarly skilled, they seem to lose ground developmentally. Okay. I'm really interested in kids who have language disorders. So that's different than kids who have weak language skills, often due to adverse developmental conditions. But what about kids who have a language learning disability, which affects about 10% of young kids? Kids with language impairment or other developmental disabilities, as I mentioned earlier, there's about 750,000 kids with developmental disabilities in the early ages, and they have the right to a free and appropriate education. And a majority of these kids across the United States spend at least some of their time in classrooms with other kids, with other children, and they have typical peers, some of the time, okay? In Ohio, I mentioned our model at the state is a 50-50 model. Now, what's legislated and done, those are 2 totally different things. But you're supposed, if you operate an early childhood special ed classroom, you're supposed to utilize a 50-50 model, which means typically it's 12 kids, 6 with IEPs, individualized education programs, and 6 who do not, okay? What happens in these classrooms? If you believe me so far, we ought to anticipate that peer effects are operating. I don't know why they'd be different, but it might be different how they play out, okay? What about kids who don't have disabilities who are spending their time with kids who have disabilities and vice versa? How does this play out? What's really interesting in the area of language is 80% of kids who are in early childhood special ed have a language issue, okay? About 50% of kids are qualifying for early childhood special ed because they have a speech language problem or the other 30%, they have a developmental disability, which usually involves language issues. From a theoretical standpoint, if 80% of kids with IEPs have language problems and they're in ECSE classrooms and have typical peers, it stands to reason they could potentially really benefit from this. We could also suggest that if you have a typical kid and they have less skilled classmates, they actually might not be affected. We see, again, remember the highly skilled kids seem not to be so affected by having classmates with limited skills. It's kids with low skills that seem most affected by skills of their peers. This study, we had 670 kids in 83 what are called early childhood special ed classrooms, all over Ohio. And so these are supposed to use that 50-50 model. We had 8 kids per classroom. We had language data on them. It was about 60% of enrollment. And as we would expect, half of the kids had IEPs. But the range in a classroom varied from a quarter of the kids to 100%. Okay? Again, if you're interested in these things, in this study, because this was so large, we used a teacher report instrument to capture kids' language skills. It's called the Developmental Pragmatic Profile. Remember that DPP. It's a teacher report checklist from the self-measure again. And we also have the class. And we use 2 levels, just like we've been doing before, but now we can actually look at whether peer effects seem to be moderated by whether or not a child has a disability. If you're interested in kids with disabilities, in preschool special ed, you're supposed to use non-categorical labels to identify receipt of service, but there are a whole bunch of kids who actually have identified disabilities. So if you're interested, for the 56% of kids who had IEPs, these are some of the things, the conditions that we saw represented. We had some kids with ASD, kids who also had a diagnosed language impairment, and then we had a whole bunch of one eaches. One each of tuberculosis sclerosis, and Turner syndrome, and Stickler syndrome, and spina bifida, and mutism. So it's a pretty heterogeneous group of kids with IEPs. 3 models were run. I'm only going to point out the things to pay attention to. So in model 1, we looked at, is that peer effect operating? We are predicting spring language from fall language, and then entering in the average level of language skills for the kids around you. And what you can see if you know how to read tables like this is we have a significant effect. So the average level of language skills of kids in ECSE classrooms seems influential to the magnitude of their growth. This is that interaction between kids' initial skills in the fall and that peer effect. And the only thing I'm going to point out with this is it's the same as the last study, that kids who have lower skills in the fall are more affected by their peers. Okay? And then the last one, here's that Iep Stats. So what we see is a significant interaction between whether a child has a disability or not in that peer effect. What's it look like? It looks like this. Let's start at this end. So the red line are kids who are typical. The dark line is kids who have disabilities. It's about half and half in this sample, right? This is the continuum of language skills of kids' peers. So put it this way, highly skilled classrooms, not so skilled classrooms. Okay, you with me so far? On this side, what you see for kids with disabilities and kids who are typically developing, if they have highly skilled classmates, their spring language skills are almost identical. If you are down here and you have kids with IEPs and kids without IEPs, and the average level of language skill in their classroom, what you see is kids who have IEPs really seem to suffer. Now, typical kids are affected too. You see that difference in that slope. But if you have kids with IEPs and their classmates overall have low levels of language skills, they are not growing in their language development over the course of the year. I hope that makes sense. So what can we conclude? Well, the number one thing we see is that we see the same pattern. Peer effects are happening. Who a child's classmates are in terms of their skills does seem to affect how much language they develop over an academic year. And peers seem to affect kids with disabilities differentially than we see for their typical peers. And those with highly skilled classmates have spring language skills similar to those without disabilities. It actually raises a whole bunch of interesting policy and practice implications. If highly skilled kids are not affected by their peers, it means that we could disrupt their peers to potentially benefit lower skilled kids. Does that make sense? If the goal is aggregate learning, that we want all kids in early childhood special education to grow optimally, and highly skilled kids don't seem to be affected a whole lot by who their peers are, perhaps we could do more integration of highly skilled and less skilled kids to benefit the kids who have lower levels of skill. Those are the kind of policy conversations that typically take place around peer effects. I'm going to share with you one more study. I ran out of time. I'm going to have to skip the last one. But this, I think, is really interesting. So if you start reading the peer effects literature, this piques your interest at all, and you're interested in development, you ought to start thinking about, well, what's the mechanism? And as someone who's interested in language, I really want to know, what is it that is affecting kids' language systems that seems to be coming from their peers? So we can ask the question, is this a direct or an indirect pathway? And so this isn't verbatim, but this is a teacher reading a book to kids in her classroom, and this is the conversation that kids have. So consider this is the fall, and this is one classroom, and you have a child say, my daddy shot a tiger on his way to work today. Another child says, well, my daddy shot a tiger today too. My daddy's strong. And then you have this little child who says, this kid who doesn't have great language skills says, my daddy do it. So you have these two kids are using pretty complex syntax, and it is complex, whether you have an eye towards recognizing complexity or not. These are pretty complex, and you got this little guy who's kind of stumbling along, producing simple sentences. And in the spring, a year later, we see this child using more complex language, and you can say, well, that's because these kids are influencing him. But the other pathway is what we call an indirect pathway. You have kids that look like this. We've got 2/3 of the kids using pretty complex syntax, so the teacher provides more complex instruction that you might capture on something like the class, on scales like concept development and language modeling. As a result, the kids grow. It's still a peer effect, but the pathway is through the teacher. Okay? So what do you think? How many people vote, this is how peer effects operate, versus this? Come on, you gotta take a stand. Is it this one? How many people? This one? Or this one? We all love teachers. Okay, so this is the same data set from the study of inclusive practices. You're going to see slight variations because it always depends on who has a complete data set for what you're asking at that time. So, but in this study, it's 700 kids, give or take, in 83 classrooms. Again, these are inclusive classrooms we used in this study. One of the reasons we're using this is because I skipped over the last one. In this study, we use this data set because we have the biggest data set per classroom. Okay, we have 60-something% of data for the kids in these classrooms. And we're interested in language growth as a function of classmates, but we're going to enter into our models a measure of teachers' instructional quality based on the class. I was going to put this up because maybe people were interested in what instructional quality looks like in early childhood special ed classrooms, because people haven't really studied this. And if you're familiar with the class, you see the same patterns that in typical early childhood classrooms, you see relatively low levels of instructional support relative to emotional support. And we see the same thing play out in classrooms that serve kids with disabilities. Okay, so again, if you're into these kind of things, we're using a slightly different approach now. All the other ones were just straight HLM multi-level models with 2 levels. But now we're going to switch to a structural equation modeling framework with hierarchical linear modeling. Does anybody actually care? I bet some of you do. How do you do this stuff? So this is the first model. Let me show you this. So, you see, oh, I did. Okay. So this is classroom quality represented with instructional support. Have you all heard of the class? Okay, if you know the class, one domain of the class is what's called instructional support. So this is our measure of classroom quality. This is fall, this is your Pier effect. This is the average level of language skills in the fall. And this is a child's spring language controlling for their fall. This is, forget this, it says record. This is their achievement in the fall. So this is that residualized gain model. A child's spring language scores controlling for their fall scores and if they have a disability or not, which you can see is a very large predictor of spring language. And this is the Pier effect. You see that? It's strong and significant, okay? And this is the indirect effect. And that indirect effect is not significant, okay? Now, I want to point out something here. The level of instructional support is a predictor of spring language skills. Teachers' instructional quality is mattering in these settings, but it is mattering simultaneous to a Pier effect. If the question I asked last week, I said, well, is it synergistic? Which means you have to look at the interaction between the Pier effect and that. We haven't done that. But what you have here is actually, this is a very strong effect. It replicates what I just shared with you. For every point that your classmates' language skills go up in the fall of the year, your language skills increase 0.74. That's a pretty big effect. But this indirect effect is not significant. If we switch out instructional support and do emotional support, it's the exact same thing. This indirect effect is not significant. Teachers' instructional quality does matter to language growth, very consistent with what we see in the literature. But it's operating simultaneously to that Pier effect, and that Pier effect is not operating through the teacher, okay? Because it is 12:15, so what can we conclude? Neither model, whether you use instructional support or emotional support, provided evidence saying that that Pier effect operates through the teacher. I'm not aware of any literature that's done this before. And so we'll have to find out if that effect holds if we start to look at other data sets. But I do want to point out that what the teacher is doing and what kids' peers are doing, which we don't know what they're doing, that is influential to the language growth of kids in these 83 classrooms. I just wanted to, one of the things we've been playing with as a function of this is, can we actually change who kids interact with in a classroom? What we do know is that young kids prefer strongly to interact with a pair. Okay, they usually do dyadic play, same gender, same skill. And this is what we're finding, that if I have a language score of 90, I'm going to go find kids who are kind of like me to play with. Okay? Can we break that pattern in a way that will help to cultivate Pier effects in a positive direction? And we're only now just beginning to explore this, and I'll do this very quickly. One of the things we've been doing is trying to promote higher interconnectedness in pre-K classrooms as a potential avenue for getting kids to interact with a larger variety of peers, ideally some who are highly skilled. And so we actually implemented a language and literacy preschool curriculum that's a whole group interaction. And the teachers employed lots and lots of scaffolding to involve all the kids twice a week in a whole group interaction. And we measured kids' social depth. How many kids do they have high levels of interaction with in classrooms where teachers did this twice a week, whole class interactive experience compared to business as usual practices, in which that type of whole group instruction with scaffolding happens very seldom in pre-K classrooms. And this was actually our outcome, is we used social network analysis to look at the number of strong ties that preschoolers have with one another in their classroom. And what teachers do is they'll take each child in their classroom, so me and Nancy, me and Sarah, and they actually rate how often we interact with each other, rarely, often, frequently, and always. So these are weighted ties. So these children are probably always, and these children are frequently, and these children are rarely or often. And so deep ties are when you see kids frequently and always interacting with one another. And what we see is that in classrooms where teachers twice a week brought the kids together in a whole class format, the kids in our treatment classrooms had deeper ties. They had a larger number of kids in their classroom who they frequently or always interacted with compared to other classrooms. And so, I mean, the way it breaks down is the odds that 2 kids in our Read It Again classrooms interacted frequently or always was almost twice as high than the odds in the business as usual classroom. To me, this actually, it actually raises many more questions than it answers for me when I think about where does this work go. Well, I'm going to skip that. What we know is that peer effects do operate in preschool classroom, and they do seem to transcend various types. I'm fairly convinced that who kids are spending their day with in a preschool classroom matters to the magnitude of language growth that they experience. But where this goes in a way that can more directly inform policy and practice, to me, is something I'm struggling with. I think it introduces as we move to universal pre-K, it's going to happen in this next decade. We want to be very deliberate about how we organize these classrooms in this really important time period of development in a way that maximizes kids' opportunity to grow instead of dampening it by decisions we make about which kids go in which classrooms. So thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah.
So in study 2, you said there was a gap of like 1.5 standard deviations over time. So was that implying that students actually got worse, or just relative to the norms they stayed further away?
That's a really good question. In that study, in study 2, from the data, it actually looked like the kids who had low skills in the fall lost ground compared to kids with low skills who had more highly skilled classes. So did they back off in development? No. But if the normal pace of development is like this for kids who are highly skilled kids, they were losing ground over the year. It's a good question. It's a very hard study to deal with, to interpret. And I only showed the barest of pieces, but it did seem like that. And I really was able to wrap around my understanding of that when I was reading all the studies on college kids. And the effect is exactly the same as what you see if you have a low-skilled college student with a low-skilled roommate versus a low-skilled college kid with a high-skilled roommate. You see the exact same effect. Good question. Yeah.
Flourish, I'm going to ask this sort of socially and politically
No, it's okay.
uncouth question.
Okay.
Right? So, but the one that I think, if you try to take this to a broad-scale, universal policy question, we get asked. So, in study 1, you actually did find that the highly skilled kids had detrimental effects from being with lower skilled kids, correct? And then and that was a non-targeted classroom.
It wasn't detrimental.
Okay.
It was not a detrimental.
Okay, but they didn't.
Yeah.
But they didn't do as well
as kids with highly skilled.
kids with highly.
But they still did better than kids who had low skills with low class ranks.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Because that's so. My question was going to be if you found that highly skilled kids don't do as well with lower skilled kids in the non-targeted classrooms. In the targeted classrooms, you find that it doesn't have a difference.
Yeah.
Still, when you take that to a universal effect, you're going to have parents who say, well, I don't want my kid being in a classroom then where they could potentially not do as well, right? If you're talking universal, not targeted. So what's your argument?
Well, I don't have an argument other than to say that the relation of the first study to what we found every time since confuses me. Yeah. It just confuses me. And so what I don't know is how much of it is specific to that. I don't know how much of it is specific to that sample. There's also, I glossed over it, but there's one major difference between that first study and everything else. And in that first study, we modeled the peer effect as a child level variable, okay? And we did that because most of the papers who have come before us do that. So, well, they don't usually use HLM, but they model that. So what they'll do is take Nancy and take the average skill of all your classmates and add that as a child level factor too. And I believe that that confuses the unit of analysis. And so what I think is that that peer effect should be treated as a group level variable. So does that matter? What we really should do is rerun that first study and switch the unit of analysis, because what happens when you treat it as a child level variable, it cranks up your power. And so I have a question now, are some of the, I mean, the effect is there at least visually, but is that a real effect that we're talking about? And I think we should relook at it. And this is something that's very, very hard. If you start looking at these studies, people are all over the place in what is the level of analysis. And theoretically, I'm convinced that we should represent it at the group level. And so I don't know how much that would affect. But yeah, it's hard to reconcile that with everything else. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I know how much you love language, and so I do have a question, and that I'm curious if you gathered children's social competence, pro-social behaviors, and aggressiveness, and maybe some indicator of self-control, because I'm curious whether these peer effects would play out very differently with measures like that, with outcomes like that.
And we have all those data. We just don't look at it. So maybe anybody in this room wants to come spend a summer in Columbus. You know, and one of the reasons we don't touch it is because we don't know what we're doing. I mean, really.
Because it would be a shame to make a recommendation based on these language data without knowing what the effects are on pro-social behavior, or aggressive behavior, or self-control.
That's a really good point. So what could be done then is to really look at if peer effects are domain specific. You know, have a couple different outcomes. And I haven't seen anybody do that at all. Yeah, I've seen it in older kids where they'll look at math and reading, and they'll see the peer effect work for reading but not math. So it may be that these are domain specific levers. Good point. Yeah.
In these studies, how are you accounting for students' language background, for students who are dual language learners or who are experiencing English for the first time in preschool?
So we have very, very, very few kids in these studies who are dual language learners. There may be kids in the classrooms who are dual language learners. In general, so a lot of these data sets are like 2004, 2005, 2006. A lot of times we were in Virginia for some of them, or rural Ohio. Some of these are all rural communities where we have very few DLLs. So I would not generalize to classrooms that serve a large number of dual language learners from these data sets. Something that ought to come soon, though, for people who have those types of data sets. Yeah.
So I just wondered, actually, after Sarah asked her question, if you have thoughts about, so you didn't find a mediating effect of teacher quality and instruction, but have you thought about other mediators? And I actually wonder about social competence. So if kids on average in a classroom are, have higher language skills, would you also see potentially their social interaction skills being stronger, and maybe that's why you're seeing those effects?
I really like your question. And the questions you're asking are exactly the kind of things I'm really compelled by. And it's hard that you have to, so the thing, I'll say, oh, what if? Why don't we look at, and the problem is, I know this sounds silly, but these are really hard models to run. And I have to beg people. So, and especially the indirect direct effect, to do HLM and an SCM framework, can anyone in this room do this? I want to know who you are because I'm going to hire you. I beg people, I walked around for 3 years trying to find somebody to do that paper with me. I have the data and I have the question. And to do HLM and an SCM framework is hard, and not that many people, where I work, it's hard to find people. And so I love your question. And it's the same kind of thing of saying, well, what if we look at a different mediator? And I look at people and they're like, I just spent a month on those, where I'm not. And that's why I said I want to look at that interaction between instructional and this, and people just look at me and they're like, yeah, you figure out how to do that. But those are exactly the kind of things I'm struggling with too, and they're really important and interesting.
Laura, we got to finish up.
Okay,
Thank you very much.